The Chapter 9, Battles Out of Bond. The day after the battle with the spiders, Bilbo and the dwarves made one last desperate effort to find a way out before they died of hunger and thirst. They got up, staggered on into the direction which 8 out of 13 of them guessed to be the one in which the path lay. But they never found out if they were right. Such day as there ever was in the forest was fading one more into the blackness of night, when suddenly out sprang the light of many torches all around them, like hundreds of red stars. Out leaped wood elves with their bows and spears, and called the dwarves to halt. There was no thought of fight, even if the dwarves had been had not been in such a state that they were actually glad to be captured. Their small knives, the only weapons they had, would have been no use against the arrows of the elves, and could hit a bird's eye in the dark. So they simply stopped dead and sat down and waited, all except Bilbo, who popped on his ring, slipped down really quickly on one side. That is why when the elves bowed to the dwarves in a long line, one behind the other, and counted them, they never found or counted the hobbit. Nor did they hear or feel him trotting well behind their torchlight as they led off the prisoners into the forest, each dwarf blindfolded, but that did not make much difference, for even Bilbo with the use of his eyes could not see the entrance. Even Bilbo could not see where they were going, and neither he nor the others knew where they had started from anyways. Bilbo had all he could do to keep with the torches, for the elves were making the dwarves go as fast as they could, sick and weary as they were. The king had ordered them to make haste. Suddenly the torches stopped, and the hobbit had just time to catch them up before they began to cross the bridge. This was the bridge that led across the river to the king's door. The water flowed dark and swift and strong beneath, and at the far end were gates before the mouth of huge caves that ran into the side of the steep slope covered in trees. They are giant beaches came right down to the bank till their feet were in the stream. Across the bridges, the elf must thrust their prisoner, but Bilbo hesitated in the rear. He did not all like the look of the cavern mouth, and as he only made up his mind not to desert his friend just in time to scuttle over at his heels of the last elves, before the great gates of the king closed behind him was a clang. Inside the passage where lit was red torchlight, and the elf guards sang as they marched along in twisting and crossing and echoing paths. These were not like those of the goblin cities. They were smaller, less deep, underground, and filled with a cleaner air. In a great hall with pillars hewn out of the head was a crown of berries and red leaves, for the autumn was come again. In the spring he wore a crown of woodland flowers. In his hand he had held a carven staff of oak. The prisoners were brought before him, and though he looked grimly at them, and he told his men to unbind them, for they were ragged and weary. Besides, they need no ropes in here, said he. There is no escape from my magic doors for those who were once brought inside. Long and searchingly he questioned to the dwarves about their doings, and where they were going to, and where they were coming from, but he got a little more news out of them than out of Sorin. They were sorely and angry, and did not even pretend to be polite. What have we done, O king? Said Balin, who was the eldest left. Is it a crime to be lost in a forest, to be hungry and thirsty, to be trapped by spiders? Are the spiders your tamed beasts or your pets, if killing them makes you angry? Such a question, of course, made the king angrier than ever. As he answered, it is a crime to wander in my realm without leave. Do you forget that you made? Do you are in my kingdom using the road that many people made? Did you not 3 times pursue any trouble my people in the forest and roast the spiders with a rioting clamor? After all the disturbance you have made, I have a right know what brings you here. And and if you will not tell me now, I will keep you all in prison until your lands you have learned sense and manners." Then he ordered the dwarves each to be put in a separate cell and to giving food and drink, but not to be allowed to pass the doors of their little prisons, until once at least of them were willing to tell him all he wanted to know. But he did not tell them that Thorin was also present with him. It was Bilbo who found out. Poor Mr. Baggins, it was a very long time that he lived in the place all alone, and always was hiding, never daring to take off his ring, hardly daring to sleep, even tucked away in the darkest and remotest corners he could find. For something to do, he took to wandering about the 11th King's palace. Magic shut the gates, but he could sometimes get out. If he was quick, the companies of the wood elves sometimes was the high king got their head, would from time to time ride or to hunt, or to other business in the woods and in the lands to the east. If Bilbo was very nimble, he could just slip out just behind him. Though it was a dangerous thing to do, more than one, he was nearly caught in the door. As they clutched together when their last elf passed. Yes, he did not dare to march among them because of his shadow, altogether thin and wobbly as it was in the torchlight, or sort of fear of being bumped into and discovered. And when he did go out, which was not very often, he did no good. He did not wish to desert the dwarves, and indeed he did not know where in the world to go without them. He could not keep up with the hunting elves all the time they were out, so he never discovered the ways out of the wood, and was left to wander miserably in the forest, terrifying of losing him until a chance came on returning. He was hungry too outside, for he was no hunter, but inside the caves he could pick up a living of some sort by stealing food from a store or table when no one was at hand. Unlike a burglar that they can't get away, but must go on miserably burgling the same house day after day. He thought this is the dreariest and dullest part of all these wretched, tiresome, uncomfortable adventure. I wish I was back in my hobbit hole by my own warm fire stove with the lamps shining. He often wished too that he could get a message for help sent to the wizard, but that of course was quite impossible, and he soon realized that if anything was to be done, it would have to be done by Mr. Baggins alone and unaided. Eventually, after a week or two of sneaking or sort of life by watching and following the guards and taking what chances he could, he managed to find out where the dwarves were kept. He found all their 12 cells in different parts of the palace, and after a time he got to know his way about very well. What was his surprise one day to overhear some guards talking and to learn that there is another dwarf in prison too, in a especially deep dark place. He guessed at once, of course, that was Thorin. And after a while, he found that his guess was right. At last, after many difficulties, he managed to find their place when no one was about, and to have a word with the chiefs of the dwarves. Thorin was too wretched to be angry any longer at his misfortunes, and was even beginning to think of telling the king all about his treasure and his quest, which shows the little slow spirit he had become. When he had Bilbo's little voice-over at his keyhole, he could hardly believe his ears. Soon, however, he made up his mind that he could not be mistaken, and he came to the doors and had a long whispered talk with the hobbit on the other side. So it was that Bilbo was able to take secretly Thorin's message that to each other, if the other imprisoned dwarves, telling them that Thorin, their chief, was also in prison close at hand, and that no one was to rebel their errand to the king, not yet, nor before Thorin gave the word. For Thorin had taken heart to come again, hearing how the hobbit had rescued his companions from the spiders, and was determined once more not to ransom himself with promises to the king of share all in the treasure, until all hope is escaping in other way. He had disappeared, until in the face of the remarkable Mr. Invisible Baggins, of whom he had begun to have a high opinion indeed, and altogether failed to think of something clever. The other dwarfs quite agreed when they got the message. They all thought their own shares in the treasure, which they quite regarded as theirs, in spite of their plight and their unstill conquered dragon. would suffer seriously, and the wood elves claimed part of it, and they all trusted Bilbo, just what Gandalf had said would happen, you see. Perhaps that was the part of his reason for not going off and leaving them. Bilbo, however, did not feel nearly as so hopeful as they did. He did not like being depending on everyone, and he wished he had the wizard at hand, but there is no use. That was no use. Probably all the dark distance of Mirkwood lay between them. He sat and thought until his head nearly burst, but no bright idea would come. One invisible ring was a very fine thing, but it was not too much among 14. But, of course, as you have guessed, he did rescue his friends in the end. This is how it happened. One day, nosing and wondering about, Bilbo discovered a very interesting things. The great gates were only the parts of the interesting case. A stream flowed under part of the lowest regions of the palace and joined the forest river some way farther on the east, beyond the steep slope out of which the main mouth opened, where this underground water course came forth from the hillside. There was a water gate. There was rocky roof came from down close to the surface of the stream, and from it a portcullis could be dropped right to the bed of the river to prevent anyone coming in or out that way. But the portcullis was often open, for a good deal of traffic went out in by the water gate. If anyone had came in that way, he would have found himself in a dark, rough tunnel leading deep into the heart of the hill, but at one point where it passed under the caves of the roof, had been cut away and covered with great oaken trapdoors. They opened upwards into the king's cellars. There stood barrels, and for the woodwelves, especially for the king, were very fond of wine. Especially their king were very fond of wine, though no vines grew in those parts. The wine and other goods were brought far from away from the kinsfolk in the south, or from the vineyards of men in distant lands. Hiding behind one of the largest barrels, Bilbo discovered the trapdoors and their use, and lurking there listened to the talk of the king's servants. He learned how the wine and other goods came up the rivers or overland to Long Lake. It seemed a town of men still throve there, built out of bridges far into the water as a protection against enemies of all sorts. And especially against the dragon of the mountains from Lake Town. The barrels were brought up the forest river. Often they were just tied together like big rafts and pulled or rolled up the streams. Sometimes they were loaded onto flatboats. When the barrels were empty, they cast them through the trapdoors, opened the water gate, and out the barrels floated on the stream, bubbling along until they were carried by the current to a place far down the river where the bank jutted out near to the very eastern edge of the Mirkwood. There they collected and tied together and floated back to the lake town, which stood close to the point where the forest river flowed into the Long Lake. For some time, Bilbo sat and thought about this water gate and wondered if it could be used for the escape of his friends. And at last he had the spirit beginnings of a plan. And on the evening meal had always been taken to the prisoners. The guards were trampling away down the passages, taking torchlight and wisdom and leaving everything in the darkness. Then Bilbo heard the king's butler bidding the Chap of the guards good night. "Now come with me," he said, "and taste the new wine that has just come in. I shall be at hard work tonight, clearing